Case 623 by Danny Yu. Chapter 27. Later. 3255703. 3255703 3255703 3255703 3255703 3255703 3255703 3255703 3255703 3255703 3255703 3255703 3255703 3255703.
Jarvis,
Tony said. His voice was still hoarse from the screaming he had put it through just yesterday.
show me the workshop surveillance from the Greenwich incident.
Sir, Jarvis said.
Are you certain? Absolutely, Jarv.
Tony swallowed. He wished he could say that he had gained a new perspective, but it had only been a day, and he hadn't slept. How could he have possibly even contemplated sleeping when he knew the kinds of nightmares that waited for him as soon as he shut his eyes, as soon as he showed a smidgen of weakness? He wished he had gained some kind of perspective, but if anything, he had more tunnel vision than he'd ever had before. Jamie. It was all about Jamie. And Tony had failed him more than he thought he had ever failed anyone before, let alone anyone who meant anywhere near as much to him as Jamie did. He hadn't gained any perspective, so he had to use Jarvis's. It was the only way to find out what went wrong, and how he could keep it from happening again.
Sir, Jarvis said, I would really advise against this. The last thing we want is to trigger another... What time is it?
Tony asked.
Where is Jamie?
It's 9:30 a.m., Jarvis said.
Jamie is at preschool. He is not scheduled to be picked up for another 6 to 7 hours. So,
Tony said,
I was out of it for 4 hours yesterday. That makes for an acceptable margin of error. Even if I lose it, you have enough time to pull me back, right?
Jarvis seemed to hesitate.
Based on previous data discounting yesterday,
he finally said.
Yes. Well then,
Tony said.
Let's get to it.
There was another moment's pause before Jarvis began to stream the previous day's recordings on the hollow screens. Tony wished, to whatever god may or may not exist, as well as Thor and his dad, that yesterday could just be erased from existence. It wasn't mortification, not really. That emotion had been bled out of Tony's system decades ago. Not even mortification's lesser cousin, humiliation. Tony was pretty sure he'd stopped feeling that even earlier. What got to him was his memory from yesterday, from after the fog had lifted, of the way Jamie had clung to him, had refused to relinquish physical contact, had refused to even consider sleeping alone, as though he was scared Tony might vanish into clear mist the moment he looked the other way. That kind of fear and helplessness, that was something Tony had never developed defenses against, would have never even wanted to. There was a part of Tony that wanted to limit Jamie's access to the workshop, clear and simple. This was where Tony spent most of his time when Jamie was in preschool, where he worked, where he tried to keep his now, with Iron Man out of the picture, limited view of the world accessible. If Jamie had had limited access yesterday, he would have never stumbled on Tony as incapacitated as he had been. Part of Tony wanted to turn his anger about the whole episode on Jarvis, or even on Bruce, who had apparently told Jamie to go hang out with Tony while Bruce prepared supper as usual. Combined with Jamie's unlimited, even by Jarvis, access, that had suddenly spelled disaster, and Tony wanted to blame that on everything and everyone. He wanted so badly to change the protocols that allowed it. But he couldn't. He had allowed Jamie to grow up in his workshop, to become so at ease with it in a way Tony had never been in Howard's. He had structured this open doors type of living. He was pretty sure he couldn't restrict it now, not without confusing and scaring Jamie. Changing boundaries should happen because of the child's development, not the parent's convenience. Tony knew that much at least. So he couldn't change the protocols, and he wouldn't change Jamie, which meant he needed to analyze his own behavior and figure out how to fix that so he would never scare Jamie like this again. That meant looking at those videos.
Come on, Jarv, he said. Play them before we're both holding Gray.
Sir, Jarvis said,
I would like to remind you that I will never be grey. I do not have any so-called grey matter, despite the colour of my observers, nor do I have any hair that might change colour with the passage of time.
Tony rolled his eyes.
I'm not liking this playing stupid thing you're doing lately, he said, even if part of it was grateful for the levity. Play the video, please.
Finally, Jarvis routed the recordings to the screen in front of Tony. It was difficult to watch, yes, but probably not for most conventional reasons. Embarrassment was yet another lesser cousin of that core emotion he'd lost track of way back in his own childhood. That wasn't what struck him. Horror hit him first. Horror at his own utter helplessness. And then it was sorrow and sympathy and some kind of utter helpless rage at watching his baby boy attempt to bring him back, help him deal. At this point in his life, Jamie should be focusing solely on his own problems, yet this, the crying and the panic from Jamie's side, marked the first real break Tony's son had had outside his reactions to his own nightmares since Killian. Tony had caused that. Tony's lack of control had caused that. Tony needed to get this under control. The thing was, he had tried to do that ever since Killian and Aim and Extremis. He'd been holding things together. Before the bad guys had come right out and put his boy in real danger. Now he couldn't get past that danger, and somehow that seemed to unlock every single thing Tony thought he'd already overcome. He tried so hard to get it all under control. As evidenced by yesterday, he'd failed so badly, it wasn't even funny. Ask Foster and Selvig and those clowns they've got telling them if they need research funds, Tony absent-mindedly said, watching the video. Figuring out a way to contact Thor at will, say, could be a real ace up the sleeve. Not to mention figuring out how to shut down portals more efficiently. And they're the best resources on that kind of research. Let's get on that if they're at all receptive, Jarv. He paused for several long, expanded moments, watching and re-watching yesterday's footage of his own breakdown. Contact Sanchez, he said at last. Tell her I'd like that referral after all. Before he could panic, let alone freak out completely, at the sound of his own decision, he sucked in a sharp breath. Send word to the daycare that I'll be picking Jamie up in 10 minutes or so. I have a feeling we could both use a day in the park. Part of him wanted to suddenly panic at that notion, at the simple idea of being alone with Jamie without another trusted adult nearby to intervene. Never mind, it was something he'd done dozens of times before. Never mind that he'd been Jamie's primary caregiver since the kid was just over 3 months old. Still, the breakdown like yesterday's would be hard to get past. Tony knew it would never be easy for him. 5 minutes into the outing, he realized he had been both pessimistic and realistic about Jamie's view of him. Jamie, somehow, incredibly, seemed to trust Tony as much as he ever did. It was the surroundings he trusted less. He looked at Tony like he was a solid pillar to build the life around, and the rest of the world like it was fragile and untrustworthy, liable to attack at any moment. Tony had only ever seen hypervigilance like this in soldiers who'd been through combat, who'd killed people and lost friends. Never ever had he imagined he would see anything like that in his barely more than a toddler baby boy. And finally he was determined that he did need help. More than Bruce could provide, more than Jarvis could provide. He needed a professional to get him back on track, or we would never, ever be able to get Jamie back on track. And that was the most important thing in Tony's whole world.
Perhaps you could tell me why you are here, Mr. Stark,
said Dr. Martin, almost the moment they were done with rudimentary introductions. Tony blinked, thrown off for a moment. Should be pretty obvious why he was here, shouldn't it? Well, I'm not here for the decor, he said, looking around at the walls and furniture, endless variations of beige and brown. Even the framed pictures hanging here and there were so generic they probably came straight out of IKEA. Frankly, it was all pretty depressing to look at. He kind of preferred Dr. Sanchez's office. Dr. Martin unexpectedly cracked a small smile at that.
Well, he said, I have found myself wishing there was some way to change the decor between sessions. I would certainly prefer something a little more interesting, but for some people, this approach feels safe, lowers the anxiety, and, well,
lowest common denominator, Tony muttered, idly beginning to brainstorm rooms that could be changed back and forth at a moment's notice without involving any actual movers or interior decorator on call.
Something like that, Dr. Martin agreed. Now, Mr. Stark, according to my secretary, you came in half an hour early, then you left the waiting room twice, only to come back each time, and now you're here in front of me. What I'm curious about is why you are here when you clearly don't want to be, and what it is that makes you resistant to the idea of treatment.
Tony fought the sudden impulse to grind his teeth, fought the way all his muscles seemed to tense. I haven't had the best experience with mental health professionals, he said at last. He rolled his eyes. Howard sent me to a shrink when I was about 5. He never really wanted a kid, you know. He wanted an heir.
He wanted a perfect little mini-me. I was so smart, so there was that. I was even too smart to think sometimes. But in all those other areas, I was kind of a failure. I didn't like crowds, I didn't like the press, I didn't like having my picture taken. I'd get nervous about it. It gave me nightmares sometimes. I guess nowadays I'd have been diagnosed with social anxiety, which was definitely not what was wanted from Howard Stark's heir.
He let out a breath. Then again, I'm pretty sure all of that's already in my file. What's not in my file is that my shrink was the asshole brother-in-law of one of Howard's business partners. Old boys club and all that. He was supposed to fix me. I hated his guts. Eventually, I stopped having my other nightmares and started just having ones about him instead. I would pretend to be sick on Wednesdays so I wouldn't have to see him. I suppose he did his job, though. I don't have social anxiety anymore. Eventually, my godfather put his foot down. I'm pretty sure he broke Howard's nose. All I know is I didn't have to go anymore, and I promised myself I would never have to go through that ever again. He sighed. So that would be why I strongly considered hightailing it out of here.
I think you've misdiagnosed yourself, the doctor said, not liking crowds or strangers at that age, and reacting negatively to being made to interact with them anyway. That is perfectly normal behavior for an introverted child. With modern psychology, I doubt you'd have been given a diagnosis at all. Your parents would have simply been advised to allow you the privacy required.
Tony snorted. Introverted. Yeah, right. I also am not entirely sure about the validity of psychology at all, he said. From what I can tell, it's the flimsiest of the soft sciences. Theories change every few years. And how is something so inaccurate supposed to do anything at all?
As far as I know, Dr. Martin said, the fields of math and physics are constantly changing as well. Doesn't seem to stop you from basing your life's work around them.
Tony shrugged. I'm not messing around in someone's brain using tools I don't understand, and which might turn out as soon as tomorrow to be utter shit.
And yet Dr. Sanchez informs me she has 2 appointments weekly with your son, with your support and consent,
Dr. Martin said. Tony sighed. I may think half of Dr. Sanchez's theories are utter bogus, but I do know that after everything he's been through, my kid needs to be able to talk freely with an uninvolved adult who isn't going to be overly judgy or react too strongly to what he has to say. It comes with the side of doctor-patient confidentiality as well, so.
Well then, Dr. Jeffrey Martin said, talk to me like that, like an uninvolved third party who doesn't have any feelings at stake. If you can afford your son that much, surely you can give yourself the same thing. He paused for a moment. That was a lot of reasons for fleeing the waiting room. Why don't you tell me what brought you here in the first place?
Tony cocked an eyebrow. I'd have thought it was obvious by now, he said at last. My kid. What else?